So we are live. We are live, and I'm coming at you with 5. Welcome to another edition of Gavin Richard Presents on my channel, GBoot2786. I'm also live streaming this on my other YouTube channel that you can check out, self-entitled Gavin Richard. Whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you all are feeling blessed and safe. We're trying to get some more people in the chat room. Sometimes it gets a little bit, it takes a little while to build up the audience. But people who are going to play this back, we'll just get started. Kenny, I have as a guest here former Brockton homicide detective Ken Williams. Ken Williams is a 20-year veteran of the Brockton Police Department. This brother's also an expert. He's testified in trials involving police brutality, as well as he's done countless other types of work. Ken, can you give everyone a description of this? Well, first off, Ken, thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking about, obviously, the George Floyd shooting. And there have been a lot of things that have just been happening, Kenny, not just George Floyd, but even the Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor shootings that have gone on. And I don't know if you're too familiar with that, but, I mean, they've been broadcasting it every day on CNN and on various news outlets. So, Ken, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, brother, for having me.
All right, thank you. So tell everybody about your website. I actually put it in the description, Ken Williams Services. Could you give us a little description about what you do now?
Sure. Under Cable Services, I'm hired as an expert witness in police practices, use of force. And many times, unfortunately, there are people in America that find themselves subjected to a wrongful death involving police officers. Sometimes police officers are justified in their use of force, and other times they're not. And I get a chance to look at some of the underlying material regarding some of these very complicated and unfortunately sometimes heinous crimes that involve citizens and police.
Right, and certainly we'll be talking about the George Floyd incident, but. Ken is from, well, his beat was in Brockton, Massachusetts. And I pointed this out on a lighter note that Brockton, Massachusetts is home to former heavyweight champion, undefeated heavyweight champion, the late Rocky Marciano, and to the undisputed middleweight champion, I believe, from 1980 to 1987, Marvelous Marvin Hagler. So is that right, Ken?
That's correct. That's correct.
See, I know my boxing, so yeah. My father was a huge. I was born in '86, so I didn't get to see like Marvelous Marvin Hagler in his heyday, in his great days. But my father. I watched all the old fights, and my father was a huge Hagler fan. I certainly remember Sugar Ray and Roberto Duran, Manos de Piedra. So yeah, man, that takes me back a little bit, but. But Ken, obviously, I guess we could get started, man. Right now, everything that's been going on, 2020 has just been a bad year overall. From the death of Kobe Bryant and his daughter Gianni Bryant, you've had this coronavirus pandemic. We've had this controversy with the elections coming up in 2020 with both parties, as far as I'm concerned, and. Now, of course, you have had these shootings, one that was apparently covered up by the Brunswick Sheriff's Department, police department out there involving Ahmaud Arbery. Then we had the police shooting of Miss Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend, someone, I can't even think of his name at this time. I'll get it a little bit later, but he was involved in that shooting and the charges were dropped. And now we have this videotape, though, just like almost similar to the Ahmaud Arbery situation, although much different in circumstances and the parties that are involved, which was clearly graphic with the George Floyd incident. Could you give me your take first on what your thoughts about Ahmaud Arbery's shooting?
I unfortunately don't get a chance to cover everything because these are very traumatic experiences. And although we seem to have every week, it just seems like someone unfortunately meets their demise by the hands of unfortunately unjust actions caused by individuals, whether it's police or citizens. So without going into all the details, I mean, things that I am familiar with briefly would be like George Floyd and the incident involving the EMT young lady who was EMT worker who was killed, shot down by police during execution of a no-knock warrant. That type of stuff I'm familiar with.
Right, but you did see the video of the Ahmaud Arbery incident, or
you would have to refresh my memory about it. I mean,
it was the young brother that was jogging, and
oh yes, okay, yes,
yeah, he was jogging, and these men had supposedly called 911 thinking he broke into a house.
Like I said, unfortunately, there's so many black people that are being gunned down or being targeted. We have reached a precipice, I believe, where people are fed up, and they are acting out as they are in Minneapolis based on all of these injustices that are taking place by citizens who are supposed to be trusted because they're hired by taxpayers to protect and serve them. But we have some people who are out here committing lynching under the guise of color of law, and that can't stand.
Oh, absolutely. And I will ask you about what you know from what you saw in the video with George Floyd. What went wrong? I think we all know, but just to hear your expertise in the maneuver that was used, and you could even hear a gentleman saying, "Hey, I'm familiar with that. You're gonna choke that man out." He was supposedly talking about a jiu-jitsu move with that knee that this one Derek Chauvin was placing on Mr. Floyd, and that was only one camera angle that I saw. I didn't know that there were two other officers behind the vehicle that were laying on Mr. Floyd. So could you give your opinion on it?
I think when we look at the facts that were just released by in the probable cause statement by prosecutors, they lay out a very thin layer of facts just to go and have the arraignment, I'm sure, of the defendant police officer that's been arrested. But in those facts, which I found very disturbing, even before the video, things that really stood out to me in their probable cause statement was, first, they had basically, it seems like someone, they stated as, quote unquote, someone called 911 regarding this counterfeit bill situation. So police normally show up, they get 911 call, they're going to show up and investigate. They don't necessarily take the veracity of a unnamed caller regarding a crime. They have to investigate. So police show up. Mr. Floyd's the driver of the vehicle. They have him exit the vehicle, and he's compliant at that point. And at some point in time, after a very short conversation, the officer turns to Mr. Floyd and says, "You're under arrest for possession of a counterfeit bill." That seems quite odd to me. I mean, I'm not sure what they gathered for evidence to go and prove that he actually committed such a crime. B, it's a low-level offense, basically, because, I mean, if he did, commit that type of crime, does it warrant the defendant officer and a second officer who arrives on scene? There's no immediate threat to officers. There's no threat that's taking place to anybody that's a citizen. Mr. Floyd is handcuffed shortly after the initiation of the car stop, so he can't pose a threat to anybody. And at the same time, when these officers show up, this is when the video that you're speaking of now starts to roll from the concerned citizens who walk up on this scene and now start to have a conversation with police about, why do you have a knee on that man's neck? Or in some instances, I heard a gentleman on the tape saying, "Hey, it looks like he has no more fight in him." And Mr. Floyd even says, "I'll get in the car," But we have in the probable cause statement that police, especially the defendant police officer being charged and arrested today, had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes. And that in that duration of those 8 minutes, that 2 minutes before the EMTs arrived, Mr. Floyd, just like the eyewitness statements in that video, had now succumbed to whatever reason medically, had no longer continued to breathe. He was no longer responsive, according to the probable cause statement. So how is it that we have one police officer charged, but we don't have other police officers charged for the conspiracy, for the accomplice, for being an accomplice to this, is something that I'm waiting to find out what is going to happen there.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up because when I look at the video, the Asian cop, his name is uh, To Thao To, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't know how if that's pronounced correctly, but he's
Yeah.
actually there. He's actually just standing there, keeping the other bystanders from stepping off the curb, and basically keeping watch. And never once does he look down, tell him, "Hey, I think that's enough, man," or tell Chauvin, get off of him, anything like that. Let's put him in the car. They just lay on him, and you can hear Mr. Floyd saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And at one point, one of his last things he even says, "They're about to kill me. I'm about to die." And that was actually one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. And when he went motionless, he was already dead at that point, or he was at least unconscious. And the officer still keeps his knee on that man's neck. So those guys really should be all charged as principals to third-degree murder and manslaughter, and we're going to discuss the charges of that as well. The ADA, the district attorney, the county attorney who came out, Mike Freeman, last night, he made a colossal mistake, I think, that aided into this rioting and so forth that was going on when he actually said that there was not enough evidence to bring a charge or something on all those lines. And I thought that was real stupid of him to say, even though he clarified it later. But certainly about the law, when it says that you are an accessory, that means you aid and abet in its commission. Am I right, Ken? I'm speaking as an attorney.
Of course, but let's take it a step further and break it down to the layman so that they can understand this even clearer. Let's say, for instance, there's no meeting of the minds at the time that this officer who arrives, Derek Chauvin, who was arrested today. Let's say, for instance, there's no verbal communication, no meeting of the minds between the police officers. Let's give some benefit of doubt and just try to throw that out there, right? Here goes the issue. When Mr. Floyd was placed into that ambulance and carted off to a hospital, which police officer spoke up about this? Which police officer clarified in a report that whatever statements were made in that report were false about Mr. Floyd resisting arrest? Which one of the officers clarified that, Officer Chauvin had a knee on this man's neck and that it was excessive force, and that they told him after or during that he needed to go and stop his aggressiveness towards Mr. Floyd because he would, potentially die from these type of actions? Which officer did that? And if there's no officer out of the three that were there with this principal officer charged, then that to me seems to be the aiding and abetting after the fact. Now, if we look at the video that I'm looking at, and we have an officer that has his knee clearly on the neck of this black man, and we have these eyewitnesses, these civilians that are saying, "Why don't you get that man in the car?" He's ready to be arrested and compliant. Get him in the car. And then at some point in time, minutes later, they're telling the police he's no longer responsive. He's non-responsive. You're killing him. And there's still no reaction by these four individuals to resuscitate, to save Mr. Floyd's life. They are all responsible from what I see.
Well, Ken, and since you brought that point up, aren't police officers, correct me if I'm wrong, they are trained to administer first aid or CPR. Am I correct in that?
They are, and they also wear what's called a community caretaker hat. If at some point in time, if you're in a situation where, let's say, for instance, you do have an immediate threat, and the officer does exercise some force to go and control an individual, after that threat is over, you're supposed to render aid if the person needs it. In this particular case, Mr. Floyd was handcuffed. He was in custody almost immediately at the time that the car stop began because he was handcuffed and he was compliant. So for this idea that four officers with a handcuffed black man, somehow he became King Kong, is an absurd story. And it's even more absurd when we see a video where a white officer with his hands in his pocket has his knee on this man's neck. There's no way from my assessment of what I'm looking at, that any of that is reasonable.
Correct. And it came out today. The autopsy report was released, and the family has also sought to have an independent autopsy report by Dr. Michael Batten. Dr. Michael Batten performed the autopsy on, he's a famous celebrity doctor. I'm sorry, a medical examiner who's done cases such as the O.J. Simpson case. He's also done the Michael Brown case, and he's also handling this case. Apparently, they are stating the autopsy report included in the criminal complaint was released that found no physical findings that support a diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. But the complaint noted that the police are trained that this type of restraint with a subject in a prone position is inherently dangerous. So I guess the question would arise in court is about causation of death. Did this officer cause that? But regardless of underlying conditions, let's say if I had diabetes, or if I had, let's just say I had cardiac arrhythmia. If you were strangling me in a position, and despite the fact that, yes, I have an underlying condition, by your actions, you're aggravating that condition, which could lead to and result in my death. So the fact that they mentioned that Mr. Floyd had hypertension or had coronary artery disease does not necessarily negate the responsibility of the police officers in this case.
Let's take it a step further. I have hypertension. I'm not dropping dead right now. Mr. Floyd may have had hypertension, but it was the police officers and how they interacted with Mr. Floyd that exacerbated his condition so that he died. And if there was not a knee on his neck, and if his heart wasn't pumping harder based on the trauma that he was experiencing, I suppose just like I'm living with hypertension right now, he'd still be alive and talking today as well.
Yeah, it's tragic and unfortunate, and I really feel I was watching The Breakfast Club for Stephen Jackson, who actually was a close friend of George Floyd. A lot of people didn't know that. We learned that Mr. Floyd was also a father to two daughters, the oldest being 6 years old. So those children are now going to be without their dad for the rest of their lives. And I can only pray for them and feel sorry, about their loss. But the charges of third-degree murder and manslaughter, Mr. Williams, do you find that to be sufficient as a police investigator?
Based on of course, every jurisdiction classifies murder a little differently between these subsets of intent and premeditation and stuff. So right. My issue, of course, is that on this video, at the end of the day, we have a video with eyewitnesses communicating with all of these officers. And at every point of that video, we have the officer, the principal officer, and the accessory, the officers that are committing the accessory to allow the principal officer to conduct what he's doing to Mr. Floyd. At no point in time does any of those officers turn to the principal and say, stop, get off of him, de-escalate. Any of these things that are trained, embedded in police officers these days, especially since several years ago when the Department of Justice started becoming embroiled in investigations with local police departments regarding their police practices, many police agencies had started retraining police officers about de-escalation, the sanctity of life, these things that were presented in a report by police chiefs that wanted to go and change these type of practices. So we have a black man that is handcuffed. And I can't find many videos on YouTube of white men handcuffed and black officers with knees on necks. So this practice of putting a knee on neck, which, does or could cause an airway restriction, could cause a person even who's experiencing this type of use of force, could be experiencing what I would term a traumatic experience, would cause their heart to beat faster, would cause them to go through a chemical process in their body. I'm not a doctor, but I know what that looks like and feels like to be scared. And I understand Mr. Floyd had to be scared. He started yelling, according to this probable cause report. He started yelling for his mama. He started saying, "I can't breathe," repeatedly. He started talking to police officers, "Please, please let me up." All of these statements seem to go towards a police officer or police officers that disregarded everything that could have saved his life. And it would have kept all of these chaotic scenes of protesters embroiled in this atmosphere of not feeling as though justice will prevail in Minneapolis. They all would have been home if Mr. Floyd had just made his way to a jail cell, and then he would have had his arraignment hearing in front of a judge. And at some point in time, if the court found that there was lack of evidence, his case would have been maybe dismissed or something like that. We have these officers that created all of this chaos in Minneapolis and disrupted the lives of all of these people. And it shouldn't just be one guy that's charged. It should be all of them.
Yes, what you're looking at right now, Ken, and for all of our viewers, these are the protests that are going on in downtown Los Angeles. This was on CNN. Very interesting. You see mostly whites out there. Now, what's interesting, Ken, when we talk about the aspect of media and how media basically Malcolm X once made this quote where he said media was the most powerful tool on the face of the earth because it has the ability to make the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent. One of the things that I saw that wasn't talked about, of course, when they come and mention looting and rioting, it almost becomes, especially when you use words like thug, it becomes a connotation with Black Americans who are looting and rioting and so forth. However, I saw from what I was looking at on my television set, mostly whites that were actually running into these stores like Target and so forth. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but let me turn the video off. It went in automatically. Sorry. But when I look at what I was saying was, I saw a clip from outside Minneapolis where the AutoZone is, and apparently there is a white male who's dressed all in black with a gas mask that is knocking out windows of the AutoZone, and he was actually followed by African American man, and it had been reported. I think they have denied it, but some people have said that this person was an undercover police officer or what we call an agent provocateur. So I don't know if you're familiar with that or if you heard that, but it seems like we're trying to be portrayed in a negative light here. And I don't condone looting per se, but I was talking with someone earlier. I had to unfriend them because they were more upset with the looting than they were that this man was killed unjustly.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to, always reflect on history because it has a chance to often repeat itself if we're not familiar with what occurred in the past. In 1968, there was the Kerner Commission report with findings regarding a history of maybe a 60-year span of prior riots that occurred in the Black community. And in this particular report, it referenced how police were always the agitators and the cause of these riots, because if you have a civil disorder from an unjust arrest or, police officers showing brutality towards Black citizens, obviously citizens at some point in time are going to say, okay, enough is enough. In this particular case in Minneapolis, just like, all the other riots that we have had, these flashpoints that have occurred in the past, Mr. Floyd, a Black man, unarmed, was killed by a white police officer. And that particular death played out on TV, and it agitated an already fragile relationship in the community between police and the Black community. So if we have people who are vandalizing buildings, setting fire to buildings, looting, and committing crimes, we certainly don't want to support that activity. But at the same time, I want to go and reference back to the fact that the government is well aware, since that 1968 commissioned report with its findings, that all of these type of riots, all of these type of activities have always been sparked by the police engaging citizens and, in some instances, lynching them. Mr. Floyd was lynched on that day in public in front of citizens, and it didn't matter what they said. They were armed with cell phones and mouths, and all that they tried to do was try to go and have the police de-escalate, and the police escalated. And Mr. Floyd's not here. And that's important for us to remember. This outcome of Minneapolis having all of these things that are occurring after that date are because of the police.
Right. No doubt about that. And like I said, again, that video, I think a lot of these riots and protests have been started. Just looking at the video I saw, I don't know if you saw it, but it was very suspicious that he just knocked out all of the windows and then walked to the back of the alley, per se. I don't know who that person was, but I thought it was interesting.
It shouldn't happen, you know what I mean? But at the end of the day, there was a crime that occurred that was heinous, and that caused these people to get out there in the middle of the road and start to go and exercise their speech. I mean, we're always, you know, trying to promote the fact that people need to go and have a First Amendment to exercise their speech. Unfortunately, you know, that sometimes means that people who are angry, you know, they act out, and they you know, this issue of other people committing crimes is in relationship to, as an effect, or caused from the police committing a heinous crime in Minneapolis, and we can't forget that, you know.
Right. As I said earlier, to that person, to that jackass, target is insured. Black men aren't. You know, I'm not. That's not condoning it, but you know. These, you know, we keep dealing with this every day, and I really believe, and I want to relate. I'm going to come back to that incident, but I even believe, however, had even the Eric Garner situation, because this reminded me of that. Had this man who choked out Eric Garner, I can't think of this police officer's name, but he was never prosecuted in that incident, not by the feds and not by the state. And he was only fired after, if I'm not mistaken, when the statute of limitations was about to expire on the federal charge. And he had served desk duty, I think, for 4 or 5 years after that, because Eric Garner was in 2014. And this happened, I believe, in 2016 when late 2016 when this was, early 2016 when this was set to expire, if I'm not mistaken. So I see similarities in that when you talk about the chokehold. Now, the chokehold has been outlawed in New York. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much outlawed, because if there's a deadly force scenario, whether it's by gun or choking somebody out, deadly force is going to be deadly force. So although it may be a practice not to employ a chokehold, that doesn't necessarily mean if an officer didn't have their gun and that was the only tool available to save themselves from an immediate threat, that they wouldn't deploy it. You see what I'm saying? So it's not something that I want to say is outlawed, as much as, you know, deadly force can occur in many different fashions. You shouldn't have police officers running suspects over with police cars either. You know, I mean, that's not part of their training either, but yet and still we do have that occur sometimes as well. And, you know, I would state, you know, that such use of force, running a suspect over with a police car, probably is excessive force, if that, because what if the police car stops on top of the individual?
Right.
You know?
Right. And you kill that person, and that's a whole nother ball game. I do know of a case that happened in Marksville. I'm glad your police talking to you about this, where these black state troopers were convicted on manslaughter charges, and they were involved in a police chase with an individual. I believe that individual was trying to run them over, and they shot at him, but they ended up killing his child who was in the car. And this was a little white boy, cute kid. And of course, the differences in how they were treated in the media, and these are police state troopers. I could tell, you could always tell, this was in Marksville, Louisiana. You could tell the difference in how they treat black police officers versus white police officers, that where the white police officers are accused of doing something even similar or worse in circumstances than these individuals are. Have you witnessed in your career anything like that before?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there are many police officers that may complain about there being, you know, let me rephrase it. Let me put it this way. Because police officers come from the community and they work as police officers. If there's discrimination in the community, there's always going to be discrimination in the police department. These aren't two different worlds. They're of the same community, the same jurisdiction, and all the things that we talk about, whether it's discrimination, inequality, racism, selective enforcement, all these things are underlying issues that negatively impact people of color. I mean, I don't believe you have too many white people walking around who say that, hey, the black people who are police officers are targeting me today, and there's a selective enforcement because I believe they're being discriminatory towards me. That's very rare. It may happen, but it doesn't happen very often, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right.
And at the same time, when we talk about these use of force on the extreme side of things where people are, being harmed, they can have studies that, they'll take a slice of information and then they'll say, maybe from 2014 to 2015, it would appear that black and white police officers are, using the same sort of force against black citizens, and that it's not just white cops as a majority doing that. Those are discussions that are, they're helpful to have, but unfortunately, many police departments around America hide a lot of the statistical data. So even the experts, the scientists, and the data that they're relying on isn't true and accurate. So if you don't have true and accurate data coming in, you're going to get a false picture coming out when you analyze that data. So, there's an issue in America. There has always been an issue in America, and it does come down to black and white. That's the reason why that Kerner Commission report was pretty specific and said that there's white America and black America, and these are two different nations, and that we need to somehow figure out policies that we can bridge the gap and start to try to tear down these barriers based on color. And white people try to run away from this issue, this discussion, and you can't run away from something that you get a white privilege and benefit from. And black people who are in law enforcement, like myself, who are well-versed and understand that history from 1964 before and during and post 1964, you have a duty. I have a duty to make sure that we speak up and we talk about these issues just like I am right now, because they are real. And you can't go to the work and understand that there's white officers, or even black officers for that matter, that are targeting people based on their race, color, national origin, gender, and they're being wrong in their actions, and stay silent. In order to go and be a good cop, you're going to have to give up a bad cop.
Right, and that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about is what they call a blue code of silence. Clearly, as a police officer, I'm sure you've heard that term around. I don't know about your experiences per se, if you want to share them, but when you have an incident like this, very rarely do I see police officers who I always hear who come out and say something against it. Like I will hear police officers that will say, when we say, for instance, excuse my language, fuck the police, like NWA says, or something like that. We don't hear, the first thing we'll hear is that, well, you can't judge all police officers. Not all cops are bad. But I never hear those people call out the bad police officers that do these horrible things. Very rarely do I do, with the exception of, someone like yourself, who I consider to be a stand-up individual, or
I appreciate that.
Yeah, a couple of I have friends and high school classmates who are police officers, and sometimes they, of course they defend the police, but other times I think when they look at situations, because they are black, these men are black as well, they should understand the whole context, the whole world that we as black people have to go through, and the interactions with police. Keep in mind, and I'm just shooting history, the police department had its early roots from the slave patrol days back in the 1800s. That's how all of that started. The paddy wagons, of course, where They got that term actually from locking up all the Irish, the Irishmen out in New York. And the gang, the term "gangs of New York," that was because when you had all the immigrants that were over here, they all fought over territory, just like what you saw in the movie that Martin Scorsese did. I'm getting off subject, but
well, I mean that particular part of the history that you're talking about is state-sponsored terrorism against Black people.
right.
Before even that more formal state-sponsored terrorism, you had the founding of America. That after the American Revolution, we had the Militia Act, which said that every able-bodied white male age 18 to 45 would bear an arm, and that was to control 100% of the Black population that was enslaved. So, even before the more formal police departments, we had this problem in America. Prior to that, we had it in the colonial period, and we're still living through the vestiges of this institutional racism that's targeted based on color of skin. And as a Black man, I'm sure you've probably had some experience with it. I have been, subjected to being stopped and questioned and frisked, even as a police officer. So I understand what that looks like and feels like even before I was a police officer. So that's the reason why I'm saying Black people who are in these professions need to go and make sure that they don't lose their footing. You can't get into that uniform and then make it seem like you don't understand what these problems are and act as if somehow you're now exempt. You've arrived and you're exempt from having these type of subject matters touch you. You still have to go and leave that police department and go home to your family and friends and neighborhoods, and you still have to have these discussions with people who are not pleased with the silence that's coming from members of law enforcement that look like you and I. I commend many Black law enforcement officers that have the fortitude to speak truth to power, and we need more. We need a lot more.
We do indeed. And I wanted to ask you this question because this was brought up by someone. We were just discussing this. I'm not quite familiar with the model penal code on self-defense and so forth. But here in Louisiana, we do have a revised statute. It's called defense of others, where if you witness, for instance, and the situation possibly, if you saw a bank teller being held up at gunpoint, if you saw a cashier at a gas station be held up at gunpoint, and you as a concealed carry permit had your firearm on you, then you could meet force with force, as we say, because that person who is being held at gunpoint unjustly and clearly unlawfully has every right to defend themselves, and the law could, while you may be prosecuted, if the facts play out, you should be acquitted on something like that. What I want to ask you is this, because someone asked this, and we were looking, and the people are standing by and not moving on these officers. I am aware that you cannot interfere with an arrest of an individual. The police officers,
lawful or unlawful,
lawful or unlawful. Right. Okay, but even in a situation like that, where this officer, it clearly looks like he isn't being tried, but I'm going to say it looks like he's trying to really knock this man out and kill him. Which is obviously not in the duties of an officer. At what point, all you're saying is that all they could do is just sit and watch?
So that's the issue with the law. The law, when you look at the MPC back in the 60s, that said that basically police officers had a duty to go and exercise enough authority and control to render a person who's being arrested, whether it's lawful or not, to bring them to jail. Let them go before a judge, and that's where the process will play out. The issue, of course, is that from a self-defense standpoint, what happens if the person can't go to jail because they're dying, right?
Right.
The problem, of course, is that it's an individual it's on an individual basis. How do you know, like those people in Minneapolis, how did they know that the police officer was going to get to the point where he killed the man? it's very difficult to get to that point where you don't have the experience of that. Those police officers who were there are trained to understand what they were doing was going to likely cause death.
Right.
But the citizens are hoping that the police officers would listen to them and stop their aggressive nature and stop their use of force and render aid to a person, and Mr. Floyd would be alive. So even though, you know, these are touchy subjects, a person who acts under that scenario, I don't know how that would play out in court. We may say under the law, it looks like we got all of these rights to go and make sure that, you know, if someone's in an immediate position of potential death, harm, that we want to intercede. But at the same time, this is the police department. They have guns, they have bullets. And for whatever aggressive act that would be coming from the citizenry, the police officers are well trained to respond to it and kill everybody if they had to.
Right. Well, that's true too. But I know that, you know, in our history, especially as a country, you know,
or let me rephrase that: not kill, but stop the threat, neutralize the threat based on their training.
Neutralize the threat.
They're not trained to kill; they're trained to stop a threat.
Stop a threat, right? But that's very correct. I also know too, in our history as a country, you know, our wars were started. You know, American Revolution was started, obviously, against violence by the British soldiers. You know, the Crispus Attucks, who was the first to die in the American Revolution, was a black man, and they all rebelled. Now, I know that we're looking specifically at what these officers did, and these were the men who were trained, obviously, to know vital signs of an individual, especially someone that they're bringing into custody. And clearly they violated that. And beyond violation, it looks like it was done purposefully, especially by Mr. Chauvin. And I'll even throw in the cop. I was about to say Asian cop, excuse me, Thom, if I'm mispronouncing his name. But when you say self-defense, well, if you look at, I want to switch gears with the Breonna Taylor incident. The boyfriend's name was Kenneth Walker. Now, my understanding is that they were executing a no-knock. There was a no-knock warrant. They were executing that against a drug dealer and they had the wrong address. And on top of that, this drug dealer, I think, had already been taken into custody. And apparently they just opened fire shooting. Now, my understanding too is that they did so much shooting that all of the bullets actually went into, which doesn't surprise me, it was going into other apartments as well, where there were children, there were women and so forth. And his name is Kenneth Walker. That is the boyfriend's name.
Sure. He
opened fire because he thought this was a robbery attempt that was happening. So clearly, I think any reasonable person sitting in his shoes would think the first thing is to defend my family, defend myself and my property. When he opened fire, and he did hit these police officers. But I don't know. And of course, there's a judge in there. And this is why we need judges. I always shout him out, Judge Olu Stevens. Sure. Judge Olu Stevens, of course, was the judge. He does not bow down. He was not afraid to actually speak his mind about the racism displayed by the prosecutors and the way they handled jury selections. And he was suspended from the bench for 6 months as a result of that. But he actually removed Mr. Walker from his bond obligation, and the police unions were not happy in Lexington, Kentucky. I believe they were not happy about that at all. And now the prosecutors have dropped the charges, I believe, without prejudice at this particular time. But clearly he had a self-defense issue.
The facts in that case are a little different, only because it involved a no-knock warrant. And police under a no-knock warrant, when they apply for that, have to show that there's an exigency to make an entry into a place based on certain circumstances. In this particular case, they already had the principal person that they were seeking in custody. So why are they still executing a no-knock warrant on a property? When they executed that no-knock warrant, Mr. Walker was inside the apartment with the victim, and he thought he was being subjected to a crime, someone trying to break into this property, and he shot his firearm through a wall or through a door, and that struck a police officer. The police officers returned fire inside the apartment, and that's how the victim succumbed to gunshot wounds. So, here we are, after the fact, Mr. Walker gets charged and arrested and charged, that is, and yes, his charges were dropped. But it's based on these technicalities. Yes, he had a self-defense, but I'm not sure if the self-defense was ever really an argument that took place in the court. His charges were dropped based on the technicality of this no-knock warrant. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, yeah, the charges were dropped, and I'm just saying, if I were him, you could also have a defense of mistake of fact. Obviously, if he thought that this was a burglary. And we saw mistake of fact play into the Amber Geiger situation that happened in 2019. She raised that as a defense and said, of course, the jury found her guilty still of murder, but she was only sentenced to 10 years in prison. And we know how that played out at the end when we saw a judge come down from the bench. And I don't even want to get back into that one because that was that was tough to look at. All that forgiveness stuff. But at any rate, I wanted to ask you this, though, too. As a police officer in your 20 years, you mentioned you were frisked and stopped as a police officer, even as a cop, by other police officers. Was this a case? And was this a case of being in the wrong neighborhood, or could you tell me?
No, I mean, if you work as a detective, especially as a black guy that's plainclothes detective, you're going to run into other members of law enforcement in the normal course of your duties, and it's probably a very dangerous position to be in. There are many black police officers that get, unfortunately, shot by friendly fire. They have a gun on them. They be, maybe mistaken to be some armed suspect, as the story goes, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, the smoke clears and they're rolling somebody over, and they got a badge on their chest. In my particular case, like any other black person, it could be something as customary as going out on a 90-degree night and walking around a car dealership to look at the prices of cars. And all of a sudden you have a police officer roll up and ask questions about whether or not you're suspicious because you're out at night looking at cars. If you're jogging in this neighborhood and there's a house being built, I can't, how many houses I've walked in that were under construction that I wanted to take a peek at, maybe how they were building something, the quality of the build, as an interested person, just a citizen. How many people end up dead from something like that? Well, we have a gentleman who was jogging one day, walked into a property being built, and he ended up dead because he was black, and the white people chased him down with guns and shot him.
Right.
We can go on and on with these stories, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the fact that white people who are committing these type of actions have and always will, unfortunately, have these upbringing thoughts and societal ills in their minds if there's no conversations that check them. We can't have it where people who are going to gyms and maybe a private gym are being stopped, questioned, and frisked by a white person who has no police authority, asking them where they live, why are they there, show some ID, crazy stuff.
Yeah, crazy stuff like that. Yeah, like the white woman who's walking her dog and wouldn't let the black man in the apartment building, and follows him all the way up to the fourth floor. And had he not had that camera on him, those things might have been different.
We have delivery drivers that are stopped inside the curtilage of private spaces and are held at against their will for an hour, in these spaces just because a white person says, I don't think you belong here. And it's like, hey, I'm delivering something here.
Right.
And these are the type of things that are playing out, and they've always played out this way. They're not new. And if we try to go and think of them as new, then we're missing the fact of history. We need to go and make sure that the future is a lot brighter than the past.
Yeah. I really wish that brother would have done donuts on his lawn. Because that one really, upset me, because I would have, I didn't know why he just didn't go on the other side and just cross over the guy. He said he didn't want to mess up the grass or anything like that. But situations like that are dangerous when you get blocked in, because God knows what type, if these men have a weapon or not, they could have just opened fire. And
if I was that brother, I would think, hey, you know what? Why would this person think that they have the power to stop me like this? They must be armed.
Yeah.
So I think at some point in time, the discussion has to be good law-abiding black citizens maybe have to start exercising a Second Amendment right. Go out, get your gun license. Go out, get trained.
Yes.
I
tell people that all the time. The Second Amendment applies to you.
Right.
It applies to all of us. So get you as many guns as you can. There are 350 million people that live in America. There are only 40 to 45 million blacks. We make up 12% of the population. You don't think white people have guns? Even during the coronavirus pandemic that I've been to a gun shop and I've seen them completely wiped out. I remember after the Sandy Hook situation, there were gun stocks at Walmart that were completely cleaned out. So there's nothing wrong with buying a firearm. I wouldn't want to be
when President Obama was elected his first term as a president. Gun sales and ammunition was low. Gun sales went sky high because white folks who were out here were panicking, thinking that it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
And here it is. We got Trump as president, and it's almost the end of the world.
Yeah, and I think, and who knows? I think those gun sales, I think they went up again because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Sure.
You couldn't find. We tried to order some ammunition, and we couldn't find it even online. Things were out of stock. So, I have 3 weapons already, and I'm looking to build to my catalog. So,
no, it's an important discussion to have, and it's not a question of trying to be a person that carries a gun to have a chip on your shoulder. A weapon is a tool, and there's going to be maybe those circumstances where if you had to defend yourself, 911 isn't available immediately, and you had to go and take matters into your own hands to go and protect you or your family. You don't want to be throwing pots and pans. You want to be throwing lead.
Right, exactly. And I live in New Orleans, so when I'm traveling, if I'm driving at night, or anything like that while I'm working at my other job or something like that, I carry a gun on me because I just never know if I'll ever get jacked. Things like that have happened. We've had incidents where people have been punched out in the French Quarter, where people have been knocked out, if part of a game, just to, I guess, please people on social media. And people have actually been seriously injured as a result of that. So I refuse to be a victim, and that's just the way I look at it.
I used at one point in time. I used to tell people, "Oh, don't worry about it. You don't need that type of stuff." But I have changed my belief system in that, and that I promote the fact that gun safety is important. Take a good gun safety class, and if you choose to, go out and purchase a firearm lawfully, legally, make sure that you're safe with that. Become familiar with that weapon and treat it such that it can cause death. So don't store it unsafely. Make sure that, you protect your loved ones with that. And hopefully you never have to use it. But if you did, it's there. And that comes from a person that's had to go and escalate to the use of deadly force as well in the profession of policing. I've had, unfortunately, people try to kill me on the job. And you have that type of immediate situation. There's very little time to think about, I wish I had. You're either reacting to the threat, which is immediate and is spontaneous, or you don't have maybe the tools necessary to go and survive the encounter.
Right, and I truly wish, just looking at it, if Ahmaud Arbery had a weapon, maybe he might still be here. Of course, he wasn't thinking of that. He was just jogging in some shorts and a shirt, and these guys just rolled up on him and blocked him off. And we talk about the principal. I do want to say this guy, Rowdy, was just charged with being accessory to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery as well. And now we're looking at a situation, although different states and different circumstances, where one man is dead at the hands of this police officer, Derek Chauvin, and these other police officers, they're principals as well, just by sitting and kneeling on this man. So it's a tough situation all around. And
self-defense is something that above and beyond the police stuff, just basic self-defense, being able to go and protect yourself is a conversation that Black people have all the time together. And I'm sure white people have these conversations all the time together. That's the reason why they buy so many guns and ammunition.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. The earliest gun control laws were actually used to keep it out of the hands of blacks. Blacks couldn't even carry a stick. And even if they had exercised it in self-defense, they would still be guilty of a Class A misdemeanor because you could not carry a weapon. And of course, they would still be found guilty because they were Black. They were not given due process and equal protection. It
wasn't until Lincoln relaxed in 1861 because of the 1862, I believe, or 1861, that he relaxed the fact that Black people could carry a firearm when they served in the Union Army. Before that, it was illegal. It was illegal for any Black person to possess a firearm in the United States. And when we think about it, white terrorism has been around since the beginning of this relationship, but yet still none of them were disqualified from carrying a firearm. So this idea of licensure and all that stuff was a reaction after the Civil War to basically disarm people who look like you and I.
Correct. Yeah. Well, Ken, you be safe up there in Massachusetts. I hope everything is going fine with this coronavirus stuff. You've all been self-quarantined and so forth, and your family is doing well.
Everyone's good up this way, brother. I hope everyone and down your way stays blessed and safe and stuff.
Yeah, thank you, and I really appreciate it. And everyone, I have put the link to Ken's website. It is kwillservices.com. Ken, of course, is an expert witness in police practices, 702 Gobert expert, use of force and forensic video analysis. He offers his services nationwide. You ever need a cop to honestly, I don't know if we have any attorneys on here that do personal injuries things or police brutality. Of course, I'm an attorney, but those that are watching that'll see this video, they may need someone. And I do have someone's information I wanted to give to you. So before I end the broadcast, I'm going to end the broadcast and I'll talk to you about it a little bit. But guys, that has been it for me. This has been another episode of Gavin Richard Presents. And Ken, I'm just looking at it too now. I mean, they're mentioning Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Dallas. These are some of the places that I saw in Atlanta myself where they actually had things that were on fire. And Los Angeles as well. I don't know about Los Angeles, but Dallas right now, they're protesting. And I'm looking at that right now. I'll just show everybody this video just real quickly of what I'm seeing in Dallas per se. With Dallas right now is on CNN. There are people there. I don't know. Yeah, just people walking right now. I saw earlier in Los Angeles, we saw the pictures. And then you saw the guy from CNN, Omar Ramirez, who got arrested.
Right.
Yeah. And then he got cleared like an hour later. I mean, he had his badge pass on and everything and showed him, and they still took him to jail. So
can't report the news being Black either. Add it to the list.
Gotta add that to the list. Yeah. So yeah. Well, anyway, guys, that's been for me. This has been another episode of Gavin Richard Presents. Please subscribe to the channel. Please also donate. I have the Cash App listed below, as well as Google Pay, the Cash App, GavinRichardEsq, and my email, Google Pay, Gavin.grich1@gmail.com. Ken Williams, thank you once again for being my guest. Everyone, you be safe, be blessed on this Friday night, especially be safe. The other weapon I want to tell you to get is to buy yourself a dashboard camera, that you can use the front and back and set it whenever you get stopped by the police that you record it, just so you know, because you never know what can happen to you. Because those things have actually they have helped a great deal, give us perspective of what goes on. Of course, that doesn't stop the actual killing per se, sadly, but nevertheless, please get you if you want to invest in it and invest in a firearm. That's it for me, guys. I love you all. Please be safe and be blessed. Thank you.